Hi, everybody. Welcome on this very beautiful day to this quite beautiful space, which is new to me anyway. I've only been in it while it's been under construction, so it's a great new thing, I think. We're going to have a conversation over lunch around a bunch of subjects, and I think maybe you want to leave a little time at the end for some questions?
Great.
Okay, so let's try to do that. So it's fairly informal. If you want to just ask a question, please do. We're in this park. Can I just ask, how many of you have been to Wagner Park at some point? Okay, that's pretty good. And how many of you sort of followed the process of its construction over the time? Okay. I'm not surprised, but that's good to know. Can I ask how many of you live in Battery Park City? Okay, almost nobody. Okay, so we can dish dirt about Battery Park City then. That's fine. So let me begin with you, Raju. So here we are. Like, how do you look at this project now after so much Dorm and Drawn?
Yeah, so hi everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Hope you're staying cool. I think this might be one of the hottest May days in history, so it's always worth reminding ourselves of that context. My name is Raju Mann. I'm the president of the Battery Park City Authority, and I've been there about 2 years and change. So all projects like this one require an endless relay race of actors, right? It started shortly after Sandy, as the city was thinking about its planning framework for Lower Manhattan and the rest of the city. And, the Battery Park City Authority began our work probably in earnest here in 2016 with some early planning studies, which turned into some, very, I'd say, simple concepts, which the park still largely embodies and the project still largely embodies, which is basically just trying to move the topography of the park inland, which is sort of where we're sitting today, and then obviously up, to create this kind of landscape flood protection strategy. And if you go back, Perkins and Will did the initial kind of design studies there. If you go back and look at that, the concept's pretty simple, and made much more rich and interesting by the architecture and the landscape around it. So I think, at least when I'm here and wander around the park, I see it as a lot of people working very, very hard over many years to deliver really 0.4 miles of coastal protection, which is, by the scale of New York City, is still pretty modest. So the thing I reflect on a lot is that these projects have to have really clear co-benefits to be, I think, durable. If they're just flood protection, it's just not going to work, I think, at the scale of the city.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, so this was really part of course, a much larger thinking that grew out of Sandy and in the Obama administration, right, to combine engineering responses with social benefits, community benefits, and to sort of rethink the way we plan infrastructure, for resilient infrastructure. Sandy was in 2012. It's now 2026. So among other things, we were just saying before we started that, you have people now in a new administration, young people who really were not necessarily following anything in 2012. There were kids, many of them. So the climate itself around all these conversations has changed. And you and I have talked a lot over the months and years around time. So I've talked about this too, like how do we measure time? We're at a place now in a very different political climate with a population that's different, which doesn't necessarily remember Sandy. And it seems like climate has receded, or at least there's less of a sense of urgency, certainly in political spheres with Hochul and, setting new timelines. Jordan, help me think our way through this. Like, where are we now, and what's different than when the conversation, as Roger said, started around Wagner Park?
Sure, and just to briefly follow up on some of the points that Raju was making. Yeah, Jordan Salinger, Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I think one thing that is demonstrably different is we are having this talk inside of a place that did not exist, a park that did not exist. And so for a long time working on these projects, these were lines on a page, and it was me coming in front of you and say, this is going to happen, trust me. And there wasn't a lot of faith. There was a lot of post-Sandy anger that I think has receded. But yes, we are in a completely different moment now. I think what you were alluding to is this sort of affordability and climate conversation butting heads with each other in ways that have led to some kind of retrenchment. And I think it is incumbent on us to make the point that the most expensive thing is doing nothing and waiting for the next storm to overlap us, folks to go to the emergency room because we aren't providing ACs, we aren't doing heat projects. And so I think stepping back and when we're hearing these things are too expensive, when there's billion-dollar price tags, the alternative is much more costly.
Yeah, that's true. I always thought when I started to write about these things that if you sold the price tag issue, if people understand that out of their pocketbooks this would be a savings, basically. But there's something very particular about the American attitude, and it's somehow embedded in I don't know whether it's our sense of optimism or our short-sightedness or what it is. But I have found that has not usually worked very well. And I wonder if that's not really much more ineffective than we think. I mean, several things happen with the price tag, right? Like they go up, and then everyone's deeply upset. And then something happens, and they forget the price tag, right? The Brooklyn Bridge, 3 times over budget, 3 times late. I mean, the delays. Supposed to take 5 years, took 15 years. Cost $15 million. $15 million to build the Brooklyn Bridge. And people were incredibly upset. Then it opens. Nobody remembers any of that. So there's the money is a funny sort of, problem to translate for people. What would it be to remind people, do you think, of the Mamdani administration is trying to tie some climate issues to other policies, which is understandable around transit and housing and so forth. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, and I think it is. I think we're also dealing with an issue of scale. At the end of the day, 10 years for one project it's kind of a smaller geography in some sense. What does that matter to the folks in the South Bronx? And so, I think a focus of this administration will be things that you can feel on your street. And so, our friends at Department of Environmental Protection have been rolling out these slotted manholes, which I think are a great example of the kind of unsexy core infrastructure that instead of doing it just like we've done it forever, we are innovating for more extreme rainfalls in these kind of very small, discrete ways that if you go on your block, you can see. And so I think it is incumbent, not just to do these critical projects, which we need to continue, but literally, if you look at a block, every single thing is a design choice. Whether we're providing shade, whether there's enough trees, it is design choice. So I think you're exactly right. The kind of big dollars, kind of create a stir quickly, people move on. I think it is, retraining that scale that I anticipate will have more success.
So having raised design, Rachel, maybe you want to talk a little bit about, I want you to describe the work that you're doing here, but as a lead into that, maybe how do you sort of think about the design of, the redesign of part of the Battery Park City to meet these different, demands, basically sometimes skeptical, even hostile, neighborhood of people?
Yeah, it's kind of a multi-layered solution because a lot of these areas that we're redesigning are already much loved public spaces that have been used for the past couple decades. And so we really want to be sensitive to the communities when we're coming in and proposing new solutions, but at the same time, the new solutions also need to work from a resiliency perspective. Wagner Park is an example where we were able to raise the grade and we're able to provide more community space, but the Northwest Battery Park City project is a little bit different because we're really confined in spaces. We're also a little bit more confined with the civic areas that are already very well loved and very well used. And so the process involves a lot of brainstorming. You know, we want to look at the criteria that we need to meet in order for the project to function on a resiliency level, but we also engage the community a lot to get their feedback, to make sure that they're in the loop on how the design and developing, how they feel about the spaces, the new kind of spaces that they want to see. It becomes a couple years of back and forth, and the community here has a very strong opinion. I think unlike the South project, the Northwest Battery Park City project is in people's backyards. I think the construction is going to have a big impact on people's lives, so we want to make sure that we're giving them the best design.
Yeah, but that is a tension, right? It's understandable nobody wants construction in their backyard. And as you say, they like what they have, and with climate you can't, you're making a bet that something is going to go wrong. But you're doing something else, right? You're also arguing that you live in a place, that a city is a collective enterprise. We're all responsible for each other. You live in a place that needs to be protected for other people as well. Do you ever say that? And if you do, is there ever a response, or do people just, what is the reaction of people like their larger social responsibility?
It's a really good question. I think, the Northwest and South Battery Park City projects are a kind of smaller part of a larger resiliency scheme. And when you're having these conversations with the community, you do need to have a little bit of a light touch when you're talking about the impact of the project, because you are impacting people's lives directly, but you also want to kind of bring it to the forefront that this isn't just a resiliency project that is going to protect their backyard. It's within this larger scope of resiliency projects that's going to protect all of Lower Manhattan. We do bring that up in a very light way. I think we do get a lot of pushback. The question usually in these conversations isn't whether or not the resiliency project is needed. It's how we're doing it, where we're putting the flood barrier system, how we're affecting the trees, where's the ice skating rink going to go. These kind of questions kind of come up more than if we should be doing the project at all.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing up there so that everyone's on the same page, or do you guys all know? I'm going to assume you don't all know all the details. Can you briefly describe what this, and then I want Roger to speak a little bit about it too.
Sure. So unlike the South project, where we were able to raise the grade in order to provide the resiliency barrier, which is also the approach on the East Side Resiliency Coastal project, at the Northwest project, we don't have a lot of space, and we're really confined with an existing platform, which is a very loved esplanade that is used by most of Lower Manhattan, if not most of Manhattan. And then we also have kind of the building face. And in between that, we are threading a flood wall, which is a very different approach than what a couple of the other projects have used. We're trying to, at the same time, leave these kind of much loved spaces, provide this kind of surgery, and then we know that in the areas where the flood wall needs to be installed and is going to require a lot of construction, we're proposing these kind of new designs, new spaces, kind of based on the community feedback that we're getting in these kind of back and forth conversations with them.
So, Roger, you and I have walked along there. We walk with students and others, often along this incredibly beautiful promenade, dated, but beautiful, conceived in another era, really, at this point. It doesn't really meet the existing needs of even the people in the neighborhood. It's often extremely crowded, it's narrow. I've suggested that we should be able to move further into the water, which should have me shot up in some quarters.
Right.
But I want to open up that conversation too. Like, there's so many parameters within which all these projects must now operate.
Right.
I just want to confirm this number. I wrote that there were 21 different agencies that needed to sign off on Wagner Park.
At least, yeah.
Yeah. And more, I think,
Yes.
to the north.
Yeah, almost double, yeah.
And then there are all these constraints that are built in.
Yeah.
So maybe we could just talk about that a little bit too.
Sure.
Like, how do you operate, and how do you think we should sort of move forward at a pace commensurate with the, the urgency of some of these needs?
Yeah, all good
A
questions.
lot of stuff.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no,
Take it as you wish.
I think for major capital projects in the city and the state, really probably anywhere in the country, we probably need a bit of a rethink on how we deliver them. If they rise to a certain level of importance, we need to find a way to actually achieve the end goal. Obviously, this is what's happening in the housing policy debates now, where it's just we're privileging the housing production over the process.
Mm-hmm.
The goal of becoming the actual thing we're shooting for, not the sanctity of the process. So I think that conversation will, slowly shift, hopefully, into other infrastructure discussions where we'll be privileging the outcome, not the constraints. And I think if you look at any problem, this is one example, you could probably design a number of different strategies from a governance or a regulatory framework standpoint that puts the outcome at the front of the table, and then how do we get there, as opposed to how do we navigate the maze to find, the little bit of cheese. So I think it just requires us flipping it on its head, putting the goal first, and then figuring out how to design a regulatory path forward. There's lots of ways to conceive of these kinds of things, but I think that's the basic inverse of what we do today, where we have a lot of process design that's almost outcome neutral.
Yeah.
So I think that's the fundamental problem, and I think there's some good lessons from the housing work that should be applied to the infrastructure delivery or the major capital projects work. So I think that's a piece of it. I do think at the end of the day, you need leadership, and then you need some degree of coalition building simultaneously. You can't just you can't wonk your way through these problems. You do need strong leadership, telling a compelling story about the future of the city, and an optimistic story in an era of climate change. And then I think you need to think about how to build the coalitions around it. For the Northwest project, it's a $2 billion project. It's all unionized labor, for example. And so I think it's incumbent on some of us to figure out how do we get people like that slightly more engaged, to then figure out how to persuade elected officials that this is the right direction forward. So I think it's multi-pronged effort. And I think, this work, 12 years after Sandy does need a little bit of a shot of caffeine. Yeah. Like we can't just keep running on the Sandy narrative as the forward-looking narrative for the city.
Well, the money's run out,
yeah.
Basically. That early tranche is obviously long gone. So how do you do that? I should ask you, Jordan.
I think, how do we do that? I mean, how do we kind of build a new climate adaptation conversation in the city? I think it has to start with some kind of vision. Like if we don't have some idea of what we're trying to get to, it just feels like a word salad. And so I think that the genius of the Hank Ovink and Sean Donovan and Obama administration work around the Rebuild by Design is that it tried to create a vision that wasn't just FEMA's going to give out a bunch of money and let's hope for the best. It was like, no, these places are going to get better, and here's how we can conceive of that. And that's actually very different than how we normally do things. So I think we need to start with some kind of vision about what we're trying to get to, and clarify what that is. And I think right now we're a little bit in between.
Well, one reason you brought this up, Jordan, was you had, I mean, this is such a long story, right? But you had, because the American history is a pendulum swing, really, of these sort of participatory processes, trust in a sort of top-down governance and then reactions against it. We're still living in the wake of the changes in the 60s and 70s, which opened up all of these processes to so much more regulation. And among those key regulations and, so important for us were environmental regulations. Those environmental regulations obviously have been used now increasingly to slow or sometimes kill projects, especially housing developments. California, pushing back on CEQA regulations so as to try to speed up housing. And then Los Angeles, refusing to abide by any of those changes. So it's a long-winded way of saying we've gotten to a point where you have good and important issues pitted against each other, like environmental regulations and housing needs. How do we reframe that conversation?
Well, it's funny, and Catherine, hopefully you're okay with me putting you on the spot, but as she approached me, she said, is this our 1,000th meeting together? And I imagine you would have been okay if we only had to do 500 of these or 250, because at the end of the day, yeah, that's what's happened post-Sandy. And in some ways it's been a privilege, right? We've been able to kind of grow and learn about new risks, and some of these projects weren't contemplating sea level rise in them or heat and trees 10, 15 years ago. And so they are much better projects than they were when they started, and the community added to that. But yes, I don't think, operating from a perspective of this needs to take 10 years, that also, you'll start to lose community trust, and, not everyone is as dedicated as you. And so.
No one, basically.
No one, to be clear. Yeah. But, I think chipping away at kind of smaller things, and, example, there was a, mentioned the kind of city charter amendments from last year. And so now if you raise a road by, a certain number of feet, you don't have to go through a full-fledged ULURP process. There's a kind of modified. And so that is deeply unglamorous, but I think, we all know these sort of things that kind of add to the clock. And so tackling them one at a time, or, once again, because there's been so much momentum on the housing front, that set of city charter amendments was, 3/4 focus on housing and a little sliver on climate. My hope is that we can kind of move the needle and figure out a lot more issues and bundle them together next time we open up the city charter.
I mean, it's a diplomatic answer, but the truth is, it's good. But it's just, the problem is that in order to enact it, you have to make some specific decision. You have to withdraw certain regulations or curtail the review processes. You have to do things that people have come to assume are part of their democratic process. And priorities, as you say, change our vision of things. I think, by the way, it is worth saying, Matthias and I have talked about this with East River Park, that some of these, the mess of this whole process often produced a better design in the end. But which is a really interesting thing. I was going to get to you about this, Rachel, but I think I don't mean to say that this is necessarily bad, but it's hard to weigh that against the costs of public trust, focus, budgets, all this sort of thing in a much larger framework. So I'll put it as, on you, Rachel. Like, I don't know how you do your job. Like, you take these projects on that can take forever, and you don't really know where they're going to, end up necessarily. Like, how do you look at the timelines and this process from a creative perspective?
Oh, that's a really hard question. Sometimes you just start the project and hold on, to be honest. I mean, the process, especially for Northwest Battery Park, has been pretty linear and steady. A lot of the times, we come up with these, we formulate these design ideas as ways to provide both protection, but as well as amenities to the public spaces that either complement the public spaces that are already there or not. And then we put the design forth, and we get numerous rounds of feedback, either from the community or from the multiple agencies. And sometimes in this design process, the design starts to die a death of 1,000 cuts. Mm-hmm. These kind of incremental small adjustments that you need to make in order to satisfy this kind of very large and varied audience of people. And at that point, you may need to go back to the drawing board. And at that point, you do have more information. You know that you need to, maybe the design doesn't need to be what you originally thought it was. And then, you may need to go through that process again. And it is kind of the iterative process of kind of circulating the design through these different audiences that really does yield the best result. Sometimes to be perfectly frank, sometimes the red tape does hurt the design. Sometimes, especially when you have such a large project that is spanning a lot of different audiences, and these audiences have very different voices, it compromises the overall identity of
So
the design.
if you can, give me a couple of examples in the case of this project. Like what had you hoped to do? What's...
Sure. I think, let me think about what I can talk about. I'll give a good example. We know that at the Irish Hunger Memorial that there is a certain look and feel. There's also a lily pond that is located there. In order to work the resilient design around the lily pond, we had to jump through a lot of engineering hurdles. We had to go back. I believe there were some permitting implications that were involved in this area. And the original design was kind of a very kind of cohesive expression of the resiliency wall through the project, and that ended up needing to take on different identities in different areas of the project, just based on these kind of different types of feedback that we get for different areas.
Roger, how do you negotiate this with residents? And like you don't necessarily share, I mean this in a good way, the views of all of the residents about what Battery Park City should be, how it fits in the city.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm old enough now, I feel like, where you have to actually have an opinion, and you can't hide behind process and vague language around community if you're gonna do projects like this. You just actually have to have a point of view, because otherwise you're gonna get lost in a fog of indecision, and then projects will take 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and you'll be chasing a kind of perceived consensus that may never arrive. So I think, it requires a little bit of just, frankly, decisiveness and some courage to say, look, we just have to do it this way, and we're going to do it this way. And here's why. And then you got to move on. And I don't think that is necessarily the, if you're looking at this stuff from a careerist standpoint, which I think is one of the challenges of all these large infrastructure projects and work in general, it's like, are you looking at it from a how do I not make mistakes, which I think government can often have that lens to it, as opposed to how do I accomplish something? And if you're looking at it the how do I not make mistakes, you can turn a conversation that should last 3 days into something that lasts 2.5 years. And so I think there's a little bit of risk tolerance that you need to have. You need to have a point of view, I think, frankly. And you need to decide kind of a little bit which side are you on in terms of your own professional orientation. Because these projects don't happen if everybody's just kind of doing things the way they always want to do them in a comfort zone. It's not going to work. I wish it required less risk-taking. I wish the environment around us supported these kinds of projects more comfortably. I wish there was a bigger tailwind. But I think at the end of the day, you still have to have a point of view. You still have to take some risks. You still have to make decisions, and you still have to move on, because otherwise nothing happens. And then that's the decision you've made, which is to not do anything.
I mean, it's true. Consensus is nice, but it basically never really is achieved.
Yeah.
But that's different than listening and making people feel that they've been heard.
Yep.
I think it was Moses who was talking back, in the day about the fact that the only way you're actually going to get stuff done, basically, is to not allow, everybody to compromise a project, and that's just so you will never achieve, a popularity contest victory.
The metaphor I like, that Sam Schwartz, used when he was doing congestion pricing as kind of a framework, and I think it's useful to borrow from other, policy arenas. Is like nobody would design the toll system we have today, and so he's like, let's wipe the slate clean and let's figure out what would it be a toll system if we were just starting from scratch. Because we've had accretive layers of like the Brooklyn Bridge is free and the Midtown Tunnel's $12 and the Verrazano is like 20, and like why is this wide variety? So it was an attempt to kind of wipe the slate clean, and I think there's a similar exercise that needs to happen now with our kind of regulatory framework around whatever those key priorities are as a society that we have, housing, transportation, climate. We just need to kind of wipe the slate clean, honestly, and rebuild what we think actually makes sense for the challenges we have, not just the accretive exercise of minor changes, when we know the problems are different problems. And I think there's some analogies that are happening out there in the policy world that I hopefully will infiltrate more fully as they get validated as the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, Rachel, I don't know if you think about this too, but I think a lot about the fact that a solution at one moment inevitably becomes the problem later. That there's the way in which we have come to try to, as Roger's saying, sort of bring everyone together and all agree that this has got to be the way, and it's a very compromised and jury-rigged thing. And inevitably, other problems arise that change our perception of that original. Moses didn't build all those highways just because he's a megalomaniac, although partly for that reason, but also because of the economy of the city and suburbanization, and for a million reasons people were driving cars. There was always a reasoning behind something, and some of it is stuff we still love, but often it's something that has become the problem for us now. So, I mean, I'm basically, by way of saying I agree, saying I think there's a certain point at which we have to just do stuff and assume that it will be the best we can do at that point, and time will tell what else we need later. But as a designer, you also have a vision of what you think is best, which you're trying to sell to a public, I guess.
Not always. As I think as a good designer, there's two parts to being a designer. There's having good ideas, being a strong problem solver. In the case of us at Big, having a brand identity that people kind of know when they hire us. But at the same time, you are an instrument to the client, and you're an instrument to the community, and an instrument to the project. And you're trying to take all of these things and problem solve them all at once. I think that the days of having, a Moses who's kind of an egomaniac making these sweeping changes on an urban scale are over. I think these projects really do require a large design team that is problem solving collaboratively together in order to make it happen. In terms of, yes, would I like all of the resiliency projects to have the same design language and identity? I think as a designer that would be stunning and beautiful, but I don't think that would serve New York City.
That's interesting. So you think that, well, you've sort of contradicted yourself a little bit. You feel you've lost some stuff, but somehow this is better for the city?
I do.
So yeah, I'm throwing Moses out there a lot because I just want to, it's lunch, you're probably getting tired. I figured it might wake you up too. But, I was writing about this not so long ago. I don't know, we built the highway system, the interstate highway system in 15 years. We were able to do things, and that caused an enormous upset. We used eminent domain for 1 million different people. And then we came to realize that was, a way we didn't want to govern. But as I said, this pendulum swing seemed to me really something that we are always correcting for. And I personally believe that we're at a moment when the pendulum is swinging back. I think the fact that we are having not just this, but many conversations around this, including, the abundance conversation. We'll have the sense of being stuck. I like to feel that this is the sign that we are open to a change of thinking. And we elected a mayor who's projecting a different approach. I was disappointed to see the mayor promised 1% at least for libraries and hasn't lived up to that promise yet. And I'm curious whether you think, Jordan, that being in office so far has sort of changed the mayor's perception of what's possible and what his priorities are.
Yeah, I wouldn't begin to be able to delve into his mind and truly give that answer. But I guess what I would say is that within the city, there is so much that we control that we haven't adequately been managing. And so I think when all the issues at the federal government, we have grants that were pulled down, kind of other challenges. I think there is more than enough work just kind of putting the kind of camera back on us. And so I think the ability to use kind of public land for housing, something we were talking about earlier, and to what you can control. There is so much there that I think has been left untouched over the years. That I think we will be very busy if we just focus on the things that we can control, and then build coalitions with the state for things that are required to go kind of outside of that.
Of course, and this is coming with a huge budget problems and a federal government that's obviously changed quite a lot. Talk about the state for a second, though, because obviously Governor Hochul has changed the targets for climate goals and stuff. How does that affect the city and your work?
Yeah, so the mayor was a sponsor, co-sponsor of the CLCPA, and so I think our position is one that we want to find ways to do as much kind of clean energy projects as possible, and so once again, that requires us to think creatively on areas that we're able to manage. On how do we get to net zero the quickest, but if there are headwinds, once again, it is about breaking the narrative of the affordability and climate conversation, because the having to choose between turning your AC on because it's more expensive, and then ultimately ending up going to the ER, like that is a false dichotomy that I think over the last year or so has really permeated, and I think part of our job is to separate those into two separate conversations, and then a project like this that is saving somewhere between $6 and $13, each dollar invested $6 and $13 at the end of the day. The FIDI Seaport project, $5 to $7 billion more dollars that we need, but that saves us $19 billion over the next century if we do nothing. So once again, I think kind of breaking those conversations apart is part of what we're here to do.
I'm going to open it up, but Raju, we talked also about Wagner when it opens, that there's a kind of proof of concept.
Yep.
This is really important, which also requires people to come see the park and
Yep.
start to use the park. So maybe you could talk about what your thoughts are about that and what your plans are here.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think we want this to be a genuinely citywide public space, not just a sort of neighborhood-facing one. So I think we're really thinking a lot about how to leverage our arts and culture programming to turn into a fantastic event and concert and art space, to really draw people here. And if they learn something about climate change, great. If they don't, and they just get to enjoy the park, wonderful too. So I think that's the next step of this piece, is to make sure that New Yorkers really get to feel it, experience it, enjoy it. Hopefully they take something away from that experience. But I think that's what I was saying earlier with this co-benefits thing. Like if we're just doing kind of, math projects on the waterfront, it's not going to be, I think, the waterfront we want. And so we have to find, the joy, the beauty, the play, the creativity in all of these projects. And they have to connect back into other goals that we have as a city. Because I think otherwise there's not a big enough coalition, frankly, to do them. May means they are more expensive, but I think they're more likely to get done that way. And they're actually more likely to get repeated over and over again, and the proof of concept sticks around. So I think that's one of the tricky things too, is that, the challenge with the climate adaptation is it doesn't really sit comfortably in any professional niche. It doesn't have its kind of organic stakeholder universe. It's like the housing world or the transportation world, or even the environmental movement hasn't yet migrated over here yet fully. You see some migration, I think, of that happening. But I think that's part of the challenges here. So then these projects have to deliver to a broad audience, because we don't have the narrow interest group that other kind of, I'd say, domains in the built environment have.
Yeah, but there's also a time scale issue, right? Some of these projects take a long time, and people are not really looking at manhole covers, as you say. So the things that are faster and easier are not visible, and things that are big and complex like this take many years. And it's often the problem with housing too, right? Like it takes a long time to build stuff. We haven't, this question of time and public attention and tolerance are tied. We're coming back to the same issue inevitably, I think. So that when something is done, it's very important, I think, that that we not only bring people to see it, but we measure the change in the reaction to what they've gotten, so that it doesn't just sort of become part of the furniture.
And that I think that we use these places as part of the narrative of the city, that we find a way to kind of weave them into the story of the city
Right.
quickly. Like, you know, I think the East Side Park is done, like we're, you know, 9/10, 9/12, 9/13. This year, it's 25th anniversary of 9/11. Bill T. Jones, who's this well-known choreographer, is going to come and do a sort of, you know, commissioned piece, basically, in Wagner. He did a piece kind of in October of 2001 to sort of on the streets of Tribeca, and he's coming back 25 years later and talking about the resilience of the city and the park. And so I think these things have to represent more than, you know, the design flood elevation and how we're solving for the design flood elevation of the 100-year storm in 2050. They just have to tap into that vocabulary of the city and the identity of the city. And then I think we've got some chances at really like doing them at scale.
I've been watching kids run around and chase each other and play, and those kids are going to possibly remember that they grew up going to Wagner Park. That's part of what changes the narrative. I want to open it up to questions for these guys here, if you have some. Sure, of course.
Hey folks, Julian Crum from New York Side.
And if you could speak up, it'll avoid me having to repeat your question.
Sure can. Thanks folks, Julian Crum from New York Fed. Wonderful conversation. Want to ask a question that I think will tie through a couple of different threads. You know, Michael certainly appreciate the nod to the need to, the drive to get things done, but to get to a point of Jordan's, I think there's also the challenge with the city and the will to pay for things. I think the turn towards things that the city can act on and make meaningful progress towards is always appreciated, but there are lots of priorities that the city has to manage and lots of things that it can do and has to do, and I think it's been historically challenging for parks, open spaces, resiliency, adaptation to warrant immediate investments, even if they deliver hundreds of billions of dollars of savings down the line. That doesn't pay for them today. So what tools, I'm wondering, do you see or strategies that communities on the ground can leverage to continue to build the motivation and will to pay for things on the city portion for the 522 and a half other miles of coastline that don't have a self-funding authority like the Battery Park City Association?
Yeah.
And holdover from the Moses Center.
Right.
So yeah, I think the part of the speed, kind of in some ways the speed of this project is because yes, the Battery Park City Authority has different tools that aren't available for the rest of the city. We are competing against borough-based jails, a variety of other things. We have kind of broader debt limits that we are coming up against. So absolutely, I think now is the moment. $15 billion post-Sandy, $500 million post-Ida. Most of that money has been spent. And so we need to think about other tools, things that we control, things that we have to go to the state. Point to a report that came out about a year ago, Resilience Funding and Financing Task Force, chaired by the former head of DEP, Rit Agarwal, and the Deputy Mayor for Operations. Offered a few different solutions. I think there's a number of others we can look at, but in some ways, I think we've kind of overcomplicated the conversation. There are, for areas that will be receiving some flood protection, there are kind of business improvement district models that we should be looking at, because yes, you may be kind of drawn out of the flood plain, and thus you are not, paying as much, and so you are receiving the benefit. So I think it is fair to ask, particularly on the kind of maintenance side, that you pay into that. There are kind of agency authority models that, if we are talking about how we decide to further tax ourselves in this climate, which is never a fun conversation, that I think we would have to go to the state to create, and I think that gives us the power to move more quickly and kind of, as you mentioned, all the rest of the coastline that we have to defend.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Raju Mann. I'm from Hoboken, New Jersey. Prior to going to private practice, I served as Hoboken's mayor for 8 years, and we were involved in the Rebuild Life Science Project, RBTHR. I served the city assembly, but I'm doing climate policy, finance, governance kind of full time, thinking about this stuff a lot more. I don't believe that the federal government or even the state government is going to save us, whether it's New Jersey or New York. Ultimately, these projects are going to be built from the ground up. And I'm just wondering how New York City is thinking about local sources of financing. You just referred to it, Jordan, and especially in the context of number one, municipal bond financing, which is really the foundation for most of the projects that are resiliency parks that we conduct in Hoboken. And secondly, the second part is what I'm seeing is that there's a disconnect between the public sector and the private sector in the way we think about the value and quantify climate adaptation. As Raju mentioned, adaptation can be a bit quirky, unlike mitigation, where you can actually quantify the benefits of clean energy, solar power, your utility bills. The kids playing around in the social infrastructure, in the private sector, in the markets, how do they quantify that? Is it quantifiable? They talk about $1 of investment equals $13 of benefits. Like, how do you drill down that into a park, for example, to attract private capital? When you look at, the private sector, they're looking at, loss of quantifying value from mitigation of business disruption, or revenue balance sheets. So that I see this disconnect between the way that the public sector values resilience, which we do, adaptation, and the private sector, which I see struggling to actually quantify that in a way that makes it bankable, and to actually create projects. Just wanted the benefit of your wisdom.
Before they answer, I just want to say, Hoboken, I think is one of the great success stories of Rebuild, and what you accomplished there was really remarkable, and it seems like you would actually be able to speak to that to some extent, because you have these parks, but you also have some of the immediate results of the resilience work that have, prevented some of those storm effects on the economies of the city. So it's a great question. I wanted to do a shout out to Hoboken, but I'm curious also whether Hoboken has lessons for other people. But if you guys want to take the question.
There's a lot there. Echo the sentiment on the progress that you've made. On the federal government side, obviously, they're not coming to rescue us. We've been fighting, for a brick grant for the Seaport variety across the city, $400 million or so that we've successfully pushed back. But I think the expectation is that even if there is a large next storm, we're not getting bailed out by the federal government in this climate. To the question of incorporating the private sector, the sort of gulf, that I feel like has been bridged on the sustainability energy side. Yes, we've not figured that out on the resiliency side. Been going to 10, 15 years of conferences where I feel optimistic in the moment and it doesn't get bridged. The fact is, Facebook is not going to help us build $5 billion project. I think that is, I keep on bringing innovative case studies from other places to our friends at OMB, and they say, we've got it, don't worry about it, we're managing enough money. This, whatever is you're contemplating here is not something that helps us. I am fundamentally an optimistic person, and so we'll keep on trying to figure out other ways to bridge the gap. But if I'm being brutally honest, the kind of the hope that the private sector, getting back to the issue of scale, is able to contribute the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that we need for these projects, I'm a little bit pessimistic on that front.
Raju, you want to take that or no?
I mean, I think it may be the question in some ways. How does the private sector decide to make this their problem too? If we're going to move the needle on it. And it's interesting to talk to, in our neighborhood, we've got large Fortune 500 companies, we've got banks, investment banks, large multinational commercial entities. And it's just not on their top 5, 10 list of things to worry about. And maybe there's somebody in the organization worrying about it. And so I think the question is one of the central questions, at least in the American context, not to sound like a talking head here, but like how does the private sector decide that this is their problem too? And is it a politics? Is it a kind of community reshaping of what our priorities are? Is it a generational question? We're kind of always hoping the kids will figure it out for us because the adults are like tired,
Yeah.
So it's like, where does the energy come that shifts some of these organizations? We're obviously not in a moment right now in particular where you're like, okay, the largest 10 companies in the world are going to go solve this for us. But I do think that is the fundamental, or one of the fundamental questions here. And, I think that's a bit of a larger social fabric question.
One more? Time for one more? Yeah.
Finally, talk about this being a potential time for new ideas. And I'm curious, we're a small new architecture firm in Brooklyn, and I wonder, this is seeing kind of the floating components are considered as part of your master planning, whether to create resiliency on the land side of the edge during the flood events, or potentially create programmable space out in the water that aren't quite as environmentally impactful and inherent to resilience.
Sounds like a Rachel question.
Yeah, it's not something that has been considered so far on the Northwest project. A lot of it is because we want to abide by FEMA's recommendations and guidelines, and I think the focus has been on a physical land barrier system. I think it's really interesting. I'd be interested to hear more. I know that there's something pretty similar done off the coast of Venice. I think that with these projects, if you're not providing an immediate public amenity, sometimes it's difficult to justify the cost for something like that. For a flood barriers, for a flood approach or a flood deterrent like this, you'd probably be spending a lot of money and the public would never actually see it until it was deployed during a storm. And so I think there's also kind of the public-facing question that ties into it.
Is that what you're asking about, the sort of barriers and Claire's project out for Highlands?
I think the idea is to actually create public benefit through programmable space that's utilized.
That's what I thought you were asking, yeah.
So, you spoke at the beginning of the talk about the idea of filling the river. And, I don't think
I don't want to leave the impression I think we should fill in the river. But yes, right.
That's what kind of got me thinking.
Yeah.
Floating pools and stuff. One more, yeah, in the back.
Hi, I just want to make a comment. My name is Nancy Owens, and I was down here with Catherine fighting for all the public open space in Community Board 1. And I was on many committees, like Salinger Park, Governor's Island Task Force, Waterfront East Side, and it was really hard to convince people why we should have trees on Greenwich Street. And that battle is over. I used to say Community Board 1 had the least parks of any community board in all 5 boroughs. But we had the least parks. So I do want to say things can happen faster if you do have the government will, but you have a community that can advocate. And I'm not in Community Board 1 anymore. I'm a public design, a landscape architect doing mostly NYCHA housing and parks. We haven't even talked about that. But a positive thing, since I was in graduate school at Berkeley, the social justice was in one lane and the environmental regulatory was in another lane. So I'm trying to be optimistic. Now they're together, finally, and you can't fund any parks in NYCHA. You get $500,000 for a park. And when I know it takes $10 million to do a park, but now they're tying it into the infrastructure project. So it isn't always, maybe in Battery Park City you can get, or ones I know I'm very familiar with, you can get those amenities, but a lot of the outer boroughs don't know the political avenues to how to advocate for those things. It's do you like a red picnic table or a blue picnic table? So I think our job is to spread the word and train an advocacy group, the community, to understand it can happen if there's a political will, but Moses. And I think look how there was no parks there. And then we built parks, and we told them we needed a library. There was no library, there were no ball fields. But the residents advocated for those things, it was positive. 9/11 happened and we rebuilt Lower Manhattan pretty fast. And the same, so I've seen, then Sandy came along, and so I've seen the building and the destruction, so I don't think it has to take so long. I think people need to know, back to your comment about the landscape architect, and know it's like a framework and getting input, and kind of somebody needs to say it's not just getting people to put a sticker on a red swing or a blue swing. I've seen that, and you do 1,000 surveys of residents and what's important. I feel like there needs to be an education of the wider borough, and a healthier city is going to be all around. You've been very special down here. Catherine, wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
I mean, we've been on many battles together, and I think, I don't know the funding mechanism. I mean, FEMA, we were supposed to do housing, a $500 million project in Harlem, but the FEMA was funding the $30 million going into the site work, and then all the FEMA money was cut. So it's not easy, but on an optimistic side, we've seen a lot of things being built in this city in my adult lifetime here, which is very exciting for me to keep going. So, and thank you for the Waterfront Alliance for holding our people together, because that wasn't just a whisper of a committee way back when I was way back when. So a lot's changed with positive. And thank you for combining environmental justice with environmental, so it's not a negative. You were talking about regulatory. Well, thank God for some of those regulatory things, but also they can work together. So.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Summary.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you.